listener production.
Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. Over the last couple of weeks, two major decisions have made global headlines concerning the reproductive rights of women. The first in Alabama, where the Supreme Court ruled that embryos created during the IVF process are children, creating massive flow-on effects. The other is on the opposite end of the spectrum, France enshrining the right to abortion in its constitution. So we wanted to ask, where is Australia at when it comes to reproductive rights of women?
In terms of reproductive rights, we see women's bodies being used as political footballs. So we see a very, very personal issue, which is also politicised beyond that individual person, and that choice be removed from that person.
In today's deep dive, we're taking a closer look at the issue as we mark International Women's Day. But first off, Katrina Blowers is here with me for the headlines. It is Friday, the 8th of March.
A 22-year-old man has appeared in court charged with murder over the disappearance of Ballarat mum, Samantha Murphy.
He has been charged with murder, so by its definition, we're saying this was a deliberate attack on Samantha.
Yeah, the 51-year-old has been missing since the 4th of February when she left home to go on a walk and she never returned. A desperate search spanning nearby forest found no sign of Samantha, and the trail had appeared to go cold until yesterday when the man, who can't be named, was arrested. He's since faced a magistrate charged with murdering the mother of three and has now been remanded in custody.
Yeah, and Samantha's body is yet to be found. Detectives say the accused has given no information as to where her remains could be, and they are appealing to the public who have even the smallest pieces of information to come forward with that so that they can bring some closure to the family of Samantha.
Yeah, Sacha, I guess for anyone listening who was looking online late yesterday and might be thinking, hang on, I remember that for a few hours there, the accused's name and photos were plastered across media reports. Why can't we name him now? Well, a nationwide interim suppression order has now been granted by a magistrate over media publishing the 22-year-old man's name, his specific address, his date of birth. And that's because the man's lawyers have argued successfully in court that there was a potential risk to his fair trial and concerns for his safety and mental health.
And look, Samantha's husband, we've heard from him in the wake of this arrest and charge, and he has expressed relief, saying that, you know, he and his family had come under really intense scrutiny during the process of people trying to find Samantha. And the family has been praised as well by the police for being so forthcoming and so cooperative with the investigation. So while it's a positive step forward for the family in getting some closure, the search continues for the remains of Samantha. A ceasefire in Gaza by Ramadan is looking unlikely after Hamas delegates left talks in Cairo without a deal made. The US, Egypt and Qatar have been trying to broker an agreement on a 6-week ceasefire and the release of 40 hostages held in Gaza in exchange for Palestinians imprisoned in Israel. Ramadan, which starts on Sunday or Monday or whenever the crescent moon is sighted, has been an informal deadline because the month often sees an increase in Israeli-Palestinian violence. Egyptian officials have previously said negotiations had reached an impasse because Hamas demanded a phased process culminating in an end to the war. Israel wants to keep the negotiations to the more limited agreement. Talks are set to resume next week, Katrina, but yes, hopes are fading that there will be this deal reached before Ramadan starts.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, just to give a bit of context here, the reason Ramadan is a time when there is often increased violence is because of access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. Now, this is the third holiest site in Islam. The mosque was built on a hilltop, which is the holiest site for Jews, who refer to it as the Temple Mount because it was the location of the Jewish temples in antiquity. Access to this site is really important. Hamas says that it launched its October 7 attack partly in response to what it sees as Israel's encroachment on the site. Hamas has also called for heightened confrontations with Israel during the holy month.
Yeah, it's has the potential there to kind of be a tinderbox situation where things could get worse, which is hard to believe in Gaza. And look, speaking of, the Malaysian Prime Minister has called on Anthony Albanese and Australia to restore funding for the United Nations aid agency in Gaza. You might remember this one had allegations made against it by Israel that some of its workers were involved in October 7. However, there hasn't been any strong proof that that is the case. Now, Malaysia's Prime Minister said he has raised the issue with Anthony Albanese during a bilateral meeting ahead of this week's ASEAN-Australia summit in Melbourne, Katrina.
Yeah, and still on this subject, but I guess switching gears just a little. If you're a Eurovision fan and you've been following along, it looks like Israel will be part of Eurovision this year. Organisers have approved Israel's revised song Hurricane, which will be performed at the contest in Sweden in May. An earlier version of this song was disqualified for political messaging, reportedly referencing victims of Hamas's October 7 attack on southern Israel. But yeah, as we mentioned, they have revised it now and they'll be allowed in.
Last night's season opener of the AFL in Sydney has included an emotional tribute to murdered Sydney couple Jessie Baird and Luke Davies. The Swans and Demons stood alongside the match's umpires at the SCG for a minute's silence ahead of the first bounce. They also wore black armbands as a mark of respect. Jessie was an umpire making his debut on the AFL's umpiring list in 2020. It was really emotional scenes, Katrina. They had this big, beautiful photo of the pair up on the big screens at the SCG, and obviously the crowd, which was almost a sellout, also participated in that minute's silence.
Yeah, and Davies was a lifelong Sydney Swans supporter and he would have absolutely loved this. The Swans then went on to win the game 86-64. And we're wrapping up the headlines today with something a little different. Yesterday, we put up a post on Instagram asking you guys the question, can white people experience racism? So this was all in the wake of reports about what Sam Kerr allegedly said to a police officer in the UK, which has resulted in a racial harassment charge. This post sparked quite a big debate among our followers and commenters and shows just how complex this issue is. At Josh Likes Pies, great handle by the way, said, apply her comment to a person who has dark skin. Is it offensive? If so, then it applies for all skin colours.
Yeah, at dipandjali.r replied to that comment saying, nope, doesn't work like that. Whiteness has never been used as a weapon against white people, while brown and black people have been for centuries called inferior for their skin colour. We also heard from at GetPapped. They made a similar comment saying white people can experience bullying, hardship and harassment. They cannot experience racism. At Graham of BD had a differing opinion and said, go to any non-white majority country. Absolutely, yes is the answer.
Yeah, and at Simple C made the point that while commenting on a person's skin colour is nasty, it is not racism. Yeah, plenty of other comments there, including a couple questioning why we'd pose such a question. I guess our thinking behind that is that at the briefing, we think that while it is a tough conversation to have, the scope of differing opinions shows it might be one worth having.
And as a society, it's important to debate these topics because I know for a fact everyone in the office yesterday and conversations that I saw online, whether it be on Facebook or TikTok, were asking this question and there was debate raging, and that's exactly what we're here to do, is to talk about the tough things. And I do want to say everyone in the comments remained super respectful, which is really nice to see. So thank you to everyone who had their say. And if you haven't yet, do head over to our Instagram page at The Briefing Podcast. You can give us a follow, leave a comment. You can also send us a DM and interact with us on our brand new broadcast channel Behind the Briefing. Katrina, have a fabulous weekend. Thanks for being here for the headlines. Next up is our deep dive into reproductive rights in Australia this International Women's Day. Today is International Women's Day, and the theme this year is Inspire Inclusion. That can mean a wide range of things, from closing the gender pay gap to improving access to education. What it also means is ensuring women and girls have the same access to opportunities at school, in the workplace, and in the wider community. One of the biggest barriers to inclusion is healthcare. And today we want to talk about reproductive rights, which can impact how and when a woman can engage with the world around her. Covering everything from periods to endometriosis to abortions, reproductive rights are vital in achieving inclusion for women and girls around the world. Today I'm joined by Bonney Corbin. She's the Director of Advocacy at MSI, which is Australia's largest abortion provider. She's also the Chair of the Australian Women's Health Alliance, to discuss where our nation stands on the issue of reproductive rights, what we're getting right, and what needs to get better. Bonney, thanks so much for your time today. Look, when we say reproductive rights, what do we mean?
That means how our reproductive rights are protected under human rights law. So it's the International Charter of Human Rights that came out after World War II. And it's how every human has reproductive rights that link to that charter. And those decisions and that link was made in the mid-1990s. So it's been in place for about 30 years. It's not particularly new. But in terms of policy cycles, we see policies turn over about every 20 or 30 years. So it makes sense that we're having these big conversations now.
What are some of the main oppositions or maybe barriers to reproductive rights in Australia? What sort of hurdles are people having to overcome in order to access healthcare in that way?
Australia has a universal health system, which is fantastic, but it's not truly universal at this point. So in many ways, we have access to reproductive rights above and beyond many other countries. However, how we access reproductive health can really depend on your postcode, which is how we frame Australian reproductive health access being a real postcode lottery. And it doesn't make sense. Because for some people in regional areas, they might have better access than people in metropolitan areas. For some people in wealthier postcodes, they might have worse access than for someone in a lower socioeconomic area. It's a real mishmash of access issues, and that's largely around the way that our Medicare system is funded and the way that our pharmaceutical benefit scheme works. And it relates to the fact that in Australia, because of our state and territory model, it means that every region is funded slightly differently depending on how that state or territory works.
Is that a flaw in the system? Should that be looked at being addressed?
I think Australia's federated model has a lot to say for the diversity of access to healthcare we have, but it also creates a number of barriers in terms of areas that are lagging behind can't necessarily get support from those that are ahead to keep up. So what I mean by that is people in Australia still fly or drive long distances between postcodes to access healthcare. And for some people, that might be a 2 or 3 hour drive. And for some people, that requires flying from Perth to Brisbane. There's very varied access to healthcare. In terms of the solution for that, definitely we need more conversations at the national level. And what we've seen in France is really indicative of that, the benefits of having a national level conversation. We do have a national women's health strategy that commits to universal access to abortion and contraception by 2030 and has a number of other reproductive health commitments. However, we're almost halfway there and we haven't made half the progress we need to be making in that time.
I guess I want to get a clearer sense for not only myself but for our listeners of what healthcare makes up reproductive rights. So I think we initially think of abortions, but what else kind of comes under the umbrella of reproductive health?
It's around reproductive justice more generally. So it's about the right to have children. It's about the right to have children in various ways in terms of surrogacy, adoption, care, kinship care, all the different ways that we nourish and support communities and raise people and live within a village that supports others. And I think we often focus on maternal health care or abortion rights because they're the sort of biological positionings for talking about reproduction, when really we're in a country that's been colonised and had a history of genocide. We need to be talking about forced adoptions and stolen generations, and we need to be talking about how the child safety system works today and what the criminal justice system does in terms of separating families. And when we think about reproductive rights, it's about so much more than just maternity care in a hospital setting, but it's about the way that every person in Australia has reproductive rights and how we can support and enable that.
Why do you think reproductive rights can represent such a contentious issue for some people? I think that on one side of the fence, you have people who say, well, of course women should have access to those things. And of course, that access should be clear and unimpeded and easy. Then you get the people on the other side who either think of it as a non-issue or have really strong feelings against certain aspects of reproductive health. Is it a symptom of the patriarchy?
Because reproductive rights ties to women's rights, I feel like there'll always be contention there because of the fact that gender equality is contentious, because of the fact that for some people to be rich, some people need to be poor, and part of the gender inequality that's existed forever is the fact that the patriarchy requires some people to be wealthier than others. And in terms of reproductive rights, we see women's bodies being used as political footballs. So we see a very, very personal issue, which is also politicized beyond that individual person, and that choice be removed from that person. So in terms of reproductive rights at their core, they tie into women's rights in the human rights system, and women's rights generally are under attack right now. So while abortion rights are under attack, it's also indicative of the broader sort of gender backlash that we're seeing at the international level. And that's because we are moving towards gender equality. We are progressing. Our region in particular, the Australian sort of Asia-Pacific region, is doing very well in terms of women's rights and gender equality in comparison to the global setting. And the backlash that we're seeing here is indicative of that. And to some extent, the backlash is showing that we're making positive change, because we wouldn't be progressing without some backlash. And in some ways, the amped up backlash that we're seeing at the moment is also a nod to the great work that's happened recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to bring up, the decision in the US, not only the 2022 Roe versus Wade call by the US Supreme Court, also more recently, literally just 2 weeks ago in Alabama, the Supreme Court there ruled that embryos created through IVF were children, which has had massive flow-on impacts that are still being figured out. On the global stage, we are in a pretty good position, right?
Yes, we're definitely ahead of the rest in many ways in Australia. We've had a suite of law reforms over the past 6 years which have enabled reproductive rights more generally in ways that we haven't seen in the past 60 years. There's been so much progress in the Australian setting. This is largely due to women in Parliament pushing different progressive bills through in a whole different swath of ways. What we're seeing here is unprecedented in the Australian context, and our access to IVF has still got a long way to go, but definitely isn't under the same threats that we saw in Alabama.
Yeah, so I guess people in Australia, I remember when the Roe v. Wade decision was made, one of the biggest, I think, ripple effects for us here in Australia was people going, well, is it that easy here for such a change to be made? It's not, is it?
It's a different context because of our judicial system. Our Supreme Court would never be in quite the same position where we'd have a turnover of decision makers who could reverse a decision like that. One of the most protective factors we have in law here is that we've had our own Australian Supreme Court uphold reproductive rights when we had safe access zones challenged in 2018 and 2019. So safe access zones are a sort of buffer zone that exists around abortion clinics to protect people accessing those clinics from harassment and intimidation. And those were challenged with some case studies in Tasmania and Victoria. And our Supreme Court not only upheld the right to have safe access zones about abortion clinics, but in their decision they asserted their support for reproductive rights generally and how it's important to uphold those rights. So in Australia, not only are we in a position where we wouldn't have a sudden switch in decision-making quite like what we saw in the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but we've also had our own Supreme Court say that they support and uphold reproductive rights when they didn't even need to make that statement. So we're in a very strong position here.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned already throughout our chat, we are miles ahead in a lot of ways, but there's always the opportunity to do better. Before we let you go, I'd love for you to run through the areas where you think the most reform is needed and what we as citizens can do to maybe push for that reform to happen.
In terms of what we just saw in France in a constitutional amendment, in Australia, the equivalent conversation we have at the moment is calls for a National Human Rights Act. So that would be one thing that would really enshrine reproductive rights at the national level that we can all go out and support. So you can contact your local MP or get involved, look up the different human rights institutions that are supporting that in your local area. In terms of the state and territory level, every state and territory has a mishmash of different legislation and progress. And I think that's about, for me at the local level, understanding that if you have someone in your life who needs to access reproductive health care, whether it be IVF, surrogacy, abortion, even basic maternity care in some settings, they can come up against a whole lot of barriers in terms of how that policy and legislation trickles down on everyday care. So for me, a big part of it is supporting our neighbours and our friends and our loved ones through these reproductive health processes that might be trickier than what some people would imagine in terms of accessing care and distance to places. In terms of volunteering time or resources, there's a lot of different community groups that advocate for reproductive rights, so people can connect in with local women's health centres or community centres or community legal centres. I think for me, it's about reading about it and talking about it. Like, the biggest challenge we have in Australia is that we've made all these great policy reforms, but they're yet to trickle down to access in health systems, and they're yet to trickle down to how we talk about it within our own communities. And I think for so many people, whether they've got heavy menstrual bleeding or they're experiencing symptoms of menopause and struggling to get access to products that could help them, everyone has trouble talking about that with their broader community, whether it's asking to leave from work or asking support from a friend. There's all sorts of different internalised and community-based barriers. So for me, it's about making sure that all of us who want to be talking about it are confident to talk about it and can open conversations within our own communities.
Well, it's a great message, this International Women's Day. And also, speaking about reproductive rights here, we did want to shine a light and to get a sense of where Australia is at in the world stage, but also, as always, what we can do to improve. You've given us some great tips there. Bonney, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that is all for this morning's podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to check back the Savo at 3 when we dive deeper into the Alabama Supreme Court decision and its implications. And if you'd like to get in touch with us at The Briefing, whether that's feedback on an episode or even a pitch for a deep dive for us to look into, head to our Instagram page and send us a message. Search us at The Briefing Podcast. And while you're there, make sure you give us a follow and join our broadcast channel Behind the Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. We'll see you soon.
Listener.